Hi, I'm Rachel Lancaster, and this is the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife and sharing some fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now's our time. My guest today, Ashton Applewhite, is an author, a speaker, and an anti-ageism activist. I discovered her work about 3 years ago, and I have literally been quoting her daily ever since. She got a standing ovation when she did a main stage TED Talk called Let's End Ageism. She has been invited to speak at the UN. She's currently between tours for her recently republished book, This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. Now, I told Ashton I was going to try not to be too fangirl gushy on this podcast, but I realised that was utterly ridiculous. There was no way I was going to manage that because this woman is my hero. So, Ashton, thank you so much. It is wonderful to have you here.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm blushing.
So my first question to you is, because obviously you've gone off on this crazy route, actually, probably, but what did you think you were going to be when you were 20?
Oh, God. I thought you were going to use the word journey. And the best thing about 2019 was that I was on a panel where anytime anyone mentioned the word journey, everyone had to take a shot. So it's really transformed that word for me. So that I offer you that. You know, I have never ever had the foggiest idea what to be when I grew up. I couldn't figure out what to major in college. I invented a major that was utterly useless. The most interesting thing I did in college was to spend a year overseas and really become fluent in a foreign language. So when I graduated from college, I just left the country and was an au pair in another country to learn that language.
Was that France?
It was France to begin with, and then Italy. It's not like I learned, Mongolian or Chinese. But, and then I traveled for as long as I could till the money ran out and failed to find a charming European to marry, which I don't think I really wanted to get married, but I wouldn't have minded not going home. But anyway, plan A failed. So I returned home, which was Washington, D.C., for about 6 weeks to get rid of the dysentery and reacquaint myself with my parents. And then I moved to New York because that's what you do. You see if you can survive in the Big Apple. And because I love to read. And I thought, well, someone might as well pay me to read. So that is literally as much of a career plan as I have ever had. I never set out to be a writer. I write because I have something to say that feels important, if that doesn't sound pretentious. It's something that feels bigger than me. And if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be fascinated by aging, I would have said, why do I want to think about something so yucky and depressing? But, aging is this journey that we all embark on the day we're born. It's how we interact with each other and institutions. It is the biggest topic there is. So for a generalist like me, it turns out to be just right. And perhaps another way of not knowing what I certainly never thought I'd be a public figure or a public speaker.
I know. And now you're massive. You are just huge.
Massive, perhaps by the tiny circle in the old land, territory that is devoted to a progressive and nuanced view of aging. I'm massive. You're right.
Getting bigger.
It is getting bigger.
There's a big conversation over here, certainly. I know you've talked about how that conversation is still pretty slow getting going in the States, but it's certainly happening over here more.
Yeah, it is. And Australia also. And I just got invited 2 days ago to a conference on longevity sponsored by the International Longevity Center in London on December 5th. So that's very exciting. And I've been invited to Australia in November, also to speak at a big gerontology conference and to promote the Australian edition of my book, which is exciting. It's exciting to see that the mainstream aging organizations, at least in the other British English-speaking parts of the world, are willing to hear what I have to say, despite the fact, in fairness, that I have no academic credentials. And despite the fact that it means, of course, no matter who I'm talking to, looking at your own internalized ageism, and people in aging services can be the most ageist of all. So it's a big ask. I understand truly why it has been slow in coming. It still hasn't come from any of the US institutions, but I think it will. And back to the fact that aging is such a huge field, if it comes from the business end, if it comes from the built environment end, if it comes from the educational end, the economics end, there's so many ways in.
Mm. But why do you think it is that Anglo-Saxon cultures, and I've been looking at this, it seems really peculiar to Anglo-Saxon cultures that we worship youth more than other cultures even. I know there are other cultures that do as well, but I think there's something about, if you look at all of the English language speaking countries, we've all had a problem with that whole just worshipping youth.
I'd like to blame it on the United States.
Really?
I like to blame most things on this country. I admit I have a ferocious bias that it's better everywhere else, although here I am still living in New York. Although, I often say it's mortifying to be an American, but I'm absolutely delighted to be a New Yorker. I think that the major culprit here is it's pop culture. Hollywood, marketing, media, and a lot of that stuff originates in the US. Our influence, our global influence in pop culture is certainly disproportionate. So, you rarely see older people at all, let alone doing all the interesting and varied things that old people do, which is the same stuff that everyone else does. Also, it's a hyper consumer driven society. And of course, if we can be persuaded that aging is a problem and that your wrinkles are, a hideous problem that you'd better spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month on, ameliorating, then, people profit from it. Likewise, if the natural transitions of aging are pathologized, and then we can be persuaded to buy stuff to cure it, right? And I do think that the US is the most consumer-driven culture, and I think we are busy exporting that to everywhere. But Australia has launched last fall, a national anti-ageism campaign called Every Age Counts. A wonderful organization called Age Platform Europe launched one across all of Europe, which was fantastically sophisticated. So, and the World Health Organization is developing a global anti-ageism campaign. Happy to talk more about the link between ageism and health. So it is cropping up all over. I think the US is slow off the bandwagon because it might cost companies money.
So in fact, if we do end ageism, we can put lots of horrible people out of business, can't we?
I hope. I don't want to put anyone out of business. I think the cost, for example, of ageism in the workplace are tremendous. Companies that are diverse, including age diversity, are not just better places to work, they work better and they are more profitable. Sometimes I say, ageism is so intense that it affects even the bottom line. Another example is the fact that so few products and services are marketed to older people, despite the fact in the US, I think it's people over 50 control something like 70% of the disposable income. It's in the book. And yet people don't even want to sell us stuff. And again, to be fair, part of that is that we older people often are reluctant to identify as older people. So, if you, for example, do a site of services, health services or wellness services or clothing or whatever for older women, a lot of older women go, oh, that's not me. And they don't shop there because of their own unexamined bias.
And it's not just sort of older women either. I mean, the whole name of my podcast is Magnificent Midlife. And I'm trying to talk to women in midlife. Yep. And those women don't want to be identified as being in midlife. It's all about, as you say, this denial that starts so early. And in fact, I suppose almost for me, I certainly had a bit of denial, and I certainly was doing that, being prejudiced against my future self, which is one of my favorite lines of yours.
I have to say, I do use it. I did not come up with it.
Aww.
Everyone who studies, because prejudice always relies on seeing a group as other than yourself, and that's a widespread, just people know that. And after you think about aging and ageism for a while, you realize, oh, wait, that other is me. So it's a powerful idea, but did not originate with me.
All right then. Well, you say it a lot. That'll do.
But midlife, I have to say, there's a line in my book about, I quote a book by Patricia Cohen about midlife, and I say midlife is a phrase or a describer to which baby boomers cling like flotation cushions. Now, we boomers, I was born in 1952, making me. I just got a brilliant answer on the book tour to the answer. How do you answer? How old are you? Say, I was born in 1952. And typically the person spazzes because they can't run the numbers.
Yeah.
And I will say, so two things happen. You've answered the question forthrightly, but the number, if we don't provide the number, we don't enable people to make those immediate assumptions that we all make when we hear a number. And also, the person has to think about how long I've been around. And so it gives the idea of experience and lifespan without stripped of the biased connotations. But, we baby boomers are now, if I'm in midlife, that means I better live to 130. And that's probably not going to happen.
That's my answer. When people say, well, when does midlife start? And I have women of 40 and they say, oh, I don't resonate with that at all. And I'm thinking, well, 80? That's probably, if you get to 80, that's a good time of life. Surely then 40 is like the beginning of midlife. That's what I actually see it as. Is 40.
Yeah. I mean, a phrase I sometimes use is if there's more road behind you than ahead.
Yes.
It might be time to start thinking. And, we are, we're all this denial is human, especially in a culture that barrages us with messages about how everything about aging is awful and ugly, especially for women. But I remember when I was a little girl and I would jump onto my bed from as far away as possible because I didn't want the monster under the bed to grab my ankles. But once I finally screwed up my courage to look, of course, it was less fearsome. There are monsters under the bed. Some part of your body is going to fall apart. People you've known all your life are going to die. Those are the only two inevitable bad things about aging. But they're awful. But looking at them, lifting up the metaphorical bed cover and looking makes it less fearsome. And I think that is universal. It's way better than imagining. Your imagining of the awfulness is invariably way more dreadful than the reality.
And in your TED talk, you talked about how the anxiety about getting dementia and things like that is now is much bigger than the actual issue itself. Isn't it?
Exactly. It's not that the fears aren't justified and that the losses aren't real. It's that our fears are so out of proportion. Dementia is a perfect example. The Alzheimer's Association says in the United States that 1 out of 10 people over 65 in the United States has dementia. That is a lot of people, but it's a couple things about that. Still means that 90% of the people in the world do not get Alzheimer's, okay, which is the most common form of dementia by far. So it is in no way typical of aging. If you were to look at a curve, and people have been querying me on this, and I don't know, I would like to see, the age is the biggest risk factor. So if this is your age, the incidence increases sharply in your 80s and 90s. But the percentage of people, in your 60s and 70s is still, it's way less than 1 in 10, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I say that I'm in the both sides of the story business. You never hear the fact that Alzheimer's rates are dropping sharply. That the odds of you or I or anyone listening to this of being diagnosed with dementia have gotten lower and lower, and that people are being diagnosed at later and later ages. This doesn't mean that it's not a terrible disease and a huge public health challenge, but it is further evidence that our fears, two things, that our fears are way out of proportion, and that stress itself is bad for you.
And it contributes to the bad things happening as we get older, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, that's
mindset issue.
There is more and more research that shows how attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. And I used to say, refer to people with more positive feelings about aging, who they walk faster, they heal quicker from severe disability. That's from the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is the premier journal here. I'm trying to think what the equivalent is in the UK. Scientists do not make that kind of unequivocal statement unless the data is rock solid, right? And so the idea is that, and live longer. People with more positive feelings towards aging are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. And I've stopped saying with more positive attitude and started to say with a more realistic attitude, because the narrative is so full of exaggerated fears that we seem like falsely optimistic if we are in fact, in contrast to that, when we're in fact just talking about the data and the science. It's not false optimism. So
what advice do you have for women who are maybe thinking, okay, yes, I am in midlife, and I'm really unhappy about this aging malarkey? What advice do you have for women who are struggling with that? Because that's something I'm so trying to change. So what do you say to them?
Well, I would say a few things. One is to be reminded about the U-curve of happiness. Google it. I think in Brit speak, it's the U-bend of happiness.
No, that would be the lavatory, sure.
That's where you find your wedding ring when you wash it down the sink. Which shows that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. So if you are indeed in midlife, that is the trough. That is when you have maximum responsibility for your children, perhaps also for the older people around you. And P.S., you're supposed to be like operating at peak performance in your career. And it's also a time of reckoning. If you are getting to that place where you are approaching, let's just say the average likely midpoint of your life, you may not become a ballerina. You may not climb Everest, and that's difficult. So this is a time of reckoning. So one reason life is hard is that you are simply at this trough. The good news is that it gets better for almost all of it. And I like to point out that if it gets better in a culture that barrages us from age sort of 8 on, that it's all going to suck, imagine what that curve would look like if we could silence that message, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that especially for we women, what is arguably the biggest ask, which it shouldn't be, because the biggest ask, honestly, is to join in a grassroots global movement like the women's movement to raise consciousness of ageism, starting between our ears and then in the world, and to take that change out into the world across class, across race, across geography. That's a big ask. But sometimes it feels like a bigger ask is for we women in particular to look more generously at each other and at ourselves. There are billion-dollar industries devoted to convincing you, all of you, that my 66-year-old face and body are hideous. But they can't take advantage of our insecurities unless we agree to it. And I think we have, you have a tremendous example here with the fat acceptance movement, the body acceptance movement, right? The back to capitalism. If we can learn to live with the fact that our thighs rub together, we're much less likely to invest in bogus, exercise stuff and diet stuff. And, people don't profit off our insecurity. Where we women are often complicit in that, and that's a very complicated argument to make. It's very nuanced. I never want to blame anyone for their own, part they play in it, because we each have to deal with a whole set of individual circumstances, advantage, disadvantage, personality, luck, class. And we each have to deal with these things in our own way and in our own time. No judgment, I swear. But when women compete to stay young, we reinforce the idea that the most important thing about us is how we look. Mm-hmm. We reinforce sexism, we reinforce ageism, we reinforce patriarchy, right? And it does not take a PhD in women's studies to know that that isn't good for us. So I think the most important thing we women can do is to come together in groups of all ages and talk about aging, talk about moving through life, because it is shocking. I like to imagine, I imagine it's better everywhere than the United States, but in the US, it's incredibly rare for people to have a friend. I have a data point about it in the book, to have a friend, someone defined as someone with whom you would discuss a personal matter, more than 10 years older or younger, which is nothing. That's not even half a generation. If more women, young women, were friends with older women, they would see how much we are actually enjoying our power, our authenticity, can I use the F word on your podcast?
You can say F word. Otherwise, I'll have to declare it. Just say F word. It's perfect.
Are giving fewer F words about stuff, which is really, really liberating, especially for women. So they would be less afraid of aging. We would be reminded how hard it is to be young, right? And a lot of older women are not nice to younger women and are not generous, right? And I think that would break down this competition, this competing thing. Hopefully younger women would be less inclined to use their social capital against us, and we would be more generous with our social capital in the form of experience, perhaps money, whatever we happen to have more of that they don't. And only by working together are we going to change the terms of discourse from terms that are not written by us or for us, that pit us against each other. I mean, we can dig the hole deeper, or we can think and act in radically different ways. This is the work of a lifetime. I look in the mirror and I still go, what the hell happened? And then I smack myself and say, a lot of shit happened and it was amazing. And,
good shit.
Yeah, bad shit, good shit. But, my face shows the map of my life. And I refuse to be embarrassed about that. To me, it's tragic. But again, honest to God, no judgment about people who do this. I really understand the reasons people have Botox and plastic surgery, because the looking young gives us currency in the conventional terms. And we're not going to change the currency until we start acting and valuing ourselves as our full, rich, messy, lumpy, wrinkled, complicated selves, and take that knowledge out into the world. And one thing I realized a while ago, and again, not to say that the currency is that you have to remain sexually active. You don't have to remain unwrinkled, or you can. It depends entirely on what's important to you. But if staying sexually active is important to you, think of your friends who are. They are not the thinnest. They are not the youngest. They are not the prettiest. They are the ones who know their lovers are lucky. They are the ones who have beaten back this ugly, capitalist, misogynist, classist script. This stuff takes money. Let's not forget, these remedies are not available to most of the women in the world because they're expensive, right? So that's another way it divides us. And say, no, we refuse to be valued and value ourselves. It has to start with us on those terms. They are not our friend, and we reject them. And we need to embark on this, we women in groups of all ages. I have on my website, which is thischairrocks.com, a resources link. And the first thing on it is a guide to starting a consciousness raising group around age bias. called Who Me, Ageist. So you can use that as a starting point. I'm really eager for some smart feminist, because I can't find the time to adapt it into a guide for women only, to guide us across this conversation. It has to involve, we have to talk about race and class too, because the women's movement in the US made a real mistake in the 70s and 80s of not addressing the issues that women of color face. And there was a schism. We don't want the movement against ageism to do that. We want it to lift all the boats. And that requires a lot of awkward conversations, but it's necessary, right? And I like to say that the women's movement taught us to claim our power, and a women's movement, and a movement against ageism will teach us to hold on to it.
Oh man,
that's a powerful idea, right?
That's a very powerful idea.
Why should we let go? Why should we? One of the fun things about going, out on tour is a lot of conversations, and I point out that one of the ways that women, frankly, reinforce a system that is not generous to us and compete so fiercely in the workplace is because we know there's only 2 seats at the table for women. So you and I are going to fight really fiercely for it. Well, I said, why should we be competing for 2 of the tables? We should be competing for half the tables. And this woman said to me, we should be competing for 100% of the seats. Why should we settle for half? Especially after men, frankly, for the most part, straight white men have had all the seats at the table all the time. So if we see this, if there are not enough seats at the table, that's not a too few women problem. That's a sexism in the workplace problem.
And of course, the older we get, the fewer the seats there are, because women, they either don't feel able to be older in the workplace and therefore they leave, or they struggle with feeling invisible. And I know you've talked about how invisibility, that actually, by trying to look younger, by changing ourselves, we actually make ourselves invisible, don't we?
It's complicated. I think it depends on how each of us, relates to that, and how much power we have, and what kind of visibility we have to start with. A friend of mine, a young friend who works in diversity and inclusion, said, what about the people who are never visible? And I went, gulp, because honestly, as a person of enormous privilege, I hadn't thought about them, right? But if we, when we compete to look young, we reinforce our own internalized ageism, because we reinforce what I call age shame. Why on earth should waking up a day older be shameful? When we knock early accomplishments off our resumes or dye our hair just to cover the gray, and I have no argument with people who dye it for fun. And again, I understand why people do these things and the reason that they are effective. But when we do those things or lie about our age, we reinforce age shame. And it is like a person of color trying to pass for straight, for white, or a gay person trying to pass for straight, a person of color trying to pass for white. They give us privilege. But these behaviors are not good for us because they're rooted in shame about something that shouldn't be shameful. And not until enough of us stop doing it are we going to, hopefully find solidarity together, which women are really good at. That is one huge advantage we have, which I know it's all about what you're doing, Rachel, and find comfort and solidarity together to change the damn narrative.
And start with the narrative inside our own heads.
Exactly. Start with that, Well,
one of the favorite things that you say, that I've said back to you before now, but I love this, that I refuse to acknowledge that this version of me now is in any way inferior to versions of me that have gone before. And I just love that. But for so many women, as you say, and well, for people generally, but I think particularly for women, because, our value is wrapped up in our beauty, our fertility, and then we go through menopause and we have this whole other life post-menopause, and yet we're not prepared for it. What are we supposed to do now?
Because the culture doesn't talk about it.
No.
Because it's related to aging, and we're supposed to be ashamed of getting old. That is why. Shame. No more shame.
Yeah. No more shame.
No more shame. And no shame around asking for help. How about that? That's a whole other thing. Everyone needs help. Lifelong, kids need help. Parents need help. People who break their ankles need help. People who are traveling in a foreign country, right? No one is independent ever. I want to knock that word independence off its pedestal in the whole discourse around aging independently or aging actively. Well, what if you can't be active anymore? Does that mean you're a failure? Does that mean your friends don't want to be seen with you? Does that mean you have to be kicked out of the retirement home because people don't want to see wheelchairs or walkers? That's ugly. I don't want to age in that world.
So what can we each do day to day to, in our own way, end ageism?
Well, I really, since I'm talking to you and you are a network of women, I really want to put out that call for women to start consciousness raising groups around age bias and make sure, reach as broadly as you can across, definitely across age. But if you can also across sexual orientation, I think class is really hard to reach across, but the more we can bring into that conversation, the more we learn about each other, because the consciousness raising is the tool that catalyzed the women's movement. Because what happened is that women came together and compared notes in a safe space. What says in the room stays in the room. Yeah. And it's a long-term proposition. You need to meet on a regular basis over months and really get to know each other. What happened was that women realized that what they were thinking of as personal problems, not getting hired, not getting heard, getting harassed, were not personal problems. They were widely shared political problems that required collective action, right? And there's a name for that shift in awareness that I came across, I think, since I finished the book. It's called cognitive liberation, which I love that term because it speaks to the nerd in me and the activist in me. This idea that we're not stuck with it's not just the way it is, right? It's a function of this. It's not our personal failing. It's a function of structures and prejudice in society around us, and we can come together and do something about it. And cognitive liberation is the linchpin of movement building. If we women can come together around aging that way, that is what we can see, is that we are not stuck with this narrative. We can do something about it. And if it seems like too big an ask, think how far we have come with the gay rights movement and the trans rights movement, even in Puritan, Anglo-Saxon, waspy, UK, and that's about sex. Ew, right? Think about how we've busted the gender binary. Yeah. So it's very, very much within our grasp. Look at what the disability rights activists did in the 70s around disability. They changed it from a personal misfortune. Oh no, you have wrinkles. Oh no, your hair is going gray. Oh no, men don't catcall you in the street anymore. And it's your fault because you failed to somehow magically stop the clock. It's the same discourse, which is even worse, around you're poor because you didn't work hard enough. That is really ugly, right? Poverty as a personal failing. I don't think so. And I don't think wrinkles are a personal failing either, right? So that narrative that it's a personal failing, we need to get around, because these are structural issues. That the disability rights people reframed aging with this brilliant political campaign. And the example I love to give, I didn't come up with it, but is that the problem is not that I'm in a wheelchair. The problem is that there are stairs between me and where I want to go. Yeah. The problem is not I somehow allowed myself to get old. The problem is that I live in a society that discriminates on the basis of age, and for women on the basis of sex as well. Aging isn't the problem. Having a vagina isn't the problem. Sexism and ageism are the problem.
And put the two together and it's awful, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. But, this whole idea of intersectionality, that different forms of oppression compound and reinforce each other, I think it's really important to remember a counterpoint to that different forms of activism compound and reinforce each other too. And that when we chip away at ageism or sexism or homophobia or, animal cruelty, whatever it is, whatever your cause is, we chip away at the fear and ignorance that underlie all prejudice. So I think it's important to realize that there's power on the other side of the equation as well.
And what about when somebody says to us that we look good for our age?
Oh, thanks for asking me the one snappy answer I have, which is say with a absolutely straight face, say you look good for your age too, and just let that awkward silence sit there, because the person has to think about why what they intended as a compliment doesn't feel like a compliment. And it is in those awkward moments, as when each of us confronts our own internalized ageism, that's when the gears start to change, and it is not easy to call people out on saying and doing ageist things, but it is really, really important. If someone says, something ageist and you don't have the snappy answer, it could be about someone else. Well, can you believe she's still working? Just say, why would you say that? Just like that. Not in a gotcha kind of way, because then people get on the defensive or say, you have no sense of humor, but just say, are you still working? Why would you ask? Right? And let them think about that assumption that they made. So, and another really specific thing each of us can do is to think about how we use the words old and young. I'm too old. I was hearing a lot, I'm too old for that. Well, you might be too smart for that. You might be too lazy for that. You might be too fat for that. You might be too sunburned for that. You might be just not interested in that. Yeah. But it's never because you're too old.
No.
Never. It's never the reason. And it's very seldom, it's almost always, we blame so much physical, problems on aging.
Oh, yes, your knees. Tell us about your knees.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great line. I have to say, I stole that line from Robert Butler, who coined the term ageism. And I don't know whether he came up with it or not, but I say in the TED Talk that I stopped blaming my sore knee on I was 64 at the time, on being 64 because my other knee doesn't hurt and it's just as old. And in the book, I tell a story of a friend of mine who was in his mid 20s at the time, who was an aerialist. And he said, he did a routine, and he said, God, I'm so sore. I'm too young to be this sore. And I went, and he said, wait, I actually hadn't stretched. I hadn't done it in a week. He was sore because he was out of shape, not because he was young, right? So think about whether we blame things on age that are in fact, not always irrelevant. Physical decline is inevitable. Some part of your body is going to fall apart, but not all of it, and we adapt. That's the thing, we adapt.
So you're going to be over in my neck of the woods soon,
I am.
You're going to be in London.
I am. I'm excited. Yep. Melville House is bringing out the UK edition of the book, which is exciting. I should explain that I self-published the book originally 3 years ago.
And I have that version.
The collector's edition.
Is it now a collector's edition?
It's worth millions.
Is it? Oh,
I'm sure.
Fantastic. It's signed by you on your birthday, which is also my birthday.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Well, we'll be in London almost for our birthday. I'll be there. No, so what am I saying? May. Our birthday's in
May, isn't it?
But I self-published it because I couldn't get a publisher to take it as seriously as I thought it should be, and not to make me the standard bearer of everything. But I do think my growing profile is a bit of a litmus test for interest in ageism and the culture as a whole. And then I sold it to a new division of Macmillan. So,
fantastic.
It's getting out there, and Melville House is bringing it out in the UK and in Australia in November. So it's happening. If you know any foreign publishers, I'll be at the Frankfurt Book Fair in September. I'd love to get it out in other languages, but it's going to happen.
So go buy it, everybody, because it's brilliant.
It's fun to read.
It is. It's a really good read.
Thank you.
And I think, the point is that it's like so many of these prejudices, when you don't know about them, you don't know about them. Yeah. But when you know about them, you see it everywhere.
You do. And that is actually liberating. The first step is you go, oh, crap. I mean, it's almost invariably the first and honest and most welcome reaction, because it shows that the person is doing that first. Really, I promise it's the worst bit. of looking
like
and going,
wits, isn't it?
oh crap, it's squeamish making. I'm so ageist. And that's what we're asking people to do when we say, why did you say that? Would you like it if someone called you adorable because you're walking with your partner? And there is this little cringe-inducing thing. But the next step of starting to see it everywhere, which is the beginning of that process of cognitive liberation, is deeply, I think, liberating and empowering, and you cannot get that genie back in the bottle.
Well, it has been an absolute delight talking to you as usual, Ashton.
You too.
And I'm incredibly grateful to you. There's so many more things I wanted to talk about, your joke books and all that. I know we've run out of time.
Well, thank you for the work you're doing. We women are going to lead this movement. We already are leading it. So let me leave you again with that maxim. The women's movement taught us to claim our power, and a movement against ageism will teach us to hold on to it. Let's hold on to it, ladies, and let's make the terms our terms that we created, not that someone else created to take advantage of us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. You can find out more about Ashton and her amazing work on her website, thischairrocks.com. If you like this episode, you'll love her book and her TED Talk too. You can get links to those and the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. If you like this podcast, please leave me a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it with your friends too. Check out our Members Club. It's where you'll find the strategies, support and connections you need to live the very best next phase of life. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.